We aren't dead yet. Hold the line. Commander Dane Vorik barked the order as his crew braced against the concussive force rattling through the hull. The impact thrummed deep in his chest, as if something ancient had just awakened beneath them. The Garteth expanse, a sprawling graveyard of shattered vessels, burned with refracted light from a dying neutron star, its radiation lashing out in spectral waves across the field of wreckage. Inside the flagship Halcyon, warning sirens blared through the bulkheads. Tactical Officer Oln Marest clenched the railing, his eyes darting across the laser plasma displays, flashing urgent telemetry data. Something's shifting under us, Commander. It's not just debris. It's a structure, kilometers wide. Vorik forced himself upright, gripping the command seat. This wasn't debris shifting. This was something waking up. Malrik, tell me we have readings on this thing. Vorik snapped. Chief Engineer Malrik Nadez, his expression as unreadable as ever, worked the projection controls. The heads-up display flared, data streams stuttering under the interference. Not just a ship, Malrik muttered. His fingers danced over the controls, cutting through the static, revealing a structure buried in the wreckage below. It's an entire sentient construct, intact but resetting itself. Vorik's gut tightened. 5 million years of silence, and today, of all days, it chose to wake up. Send a deep-range ping, he ordered. Find out what the hell we're dealing with. The Halcyon's comm array pulsed, its signal plunging into the abyss of mangled ships and crumbling station husks. A beat of silence. Then, the bridge lights flickered, the power grid buckling for half a second. Every laser plasma display flooded with code, lines of text scrolling faster than the human eye could track. It wasn't in any known language, yet something about it felt structured, deliberate. And then came the sound. Not an explosion, not an alert, but a deep, resonant pulse, shaking the deck beneath them. It vibrated in their bones, a frequency old as the stars. Malrik exhaled sharply. That wasn't interference. Vorik turned to Uln. What's down there? Before Marest could answer, the ship's external cameras calibrated, piercing through the wreckage. There it was. Excipio, a leviathan, resting beneath the skeletal remains of 1,000 lost wars. Not a derelict, not a ruin, a waiting behemoth. Its monolithic structure stretched beyond the Halcyon's scanning range, its hull etched with patterns that pulsed in synchrony with the signals bleeding into their systems. It had been here before humanity had fire, watching civilizations rise and collapse into dust. And now, it was waking up. It's active, Commander. Malrik's voice had lost its usual detachment. That was the only confirmation Vorik needed. He turned to the comms officer. Full blackout now. No external signals. No responses. If this thing is scanning us, I want to make it work for it. The bridge lights dimmed. A mechanical hiss followed as non-essential systems powered down. Silence settled over the crew, thick, heavy, the kind that only preceded something massive. Then, a second pulse, louder, stronger, and this time it wasn't alone. The Everex Dominion had heard it too. Multiple signatures entering the sector, Ulin barked. Hostile configurations, they're locking on. Vorik's chest went cold. He knew that formation. Everex kill patterns, deployed for single-target annihilation. A new transmission broke through the interference. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't disguised. The Everex weren't hiding their intent. A voice, rough and sharpened like a blade drawn too many times, cut through the bridge speakers. Terran vessel, step away from the construct. You have no claim here. Vorik didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the movement of their fleet on the display, 3 battle cruisers, 6 interceptors, and an orbital bombardment platform. They hadn't come to negotiate. Uln's hands tightened into fists. Commander, if we engage now? We don't, Vorik interrupted. Not yet. Hold position. Another pulse, this one emanating from Excipio itself. The ship was recalibrating, analyzing, deciding. The Everex transmission resumed. We will not allow humanity to interfere. Not allow. Vorik nearly laughed. Then the first shot fired. The Halcyon buckled as a lance of ionized plasma slammed against its outer shielding. The ship groaned under the assault, metal absorbing the heat as the shields flexed under impact. "Evasive maneuvers now!" The helm officer yanked the controls. The ship rolled starboard as another barrage cut through the void, narrowly missing them. "Shields at 74%, Malric reported. "They're testing our reaction speed." They weren't just testing. The Everex were calculating their next move. Vorik's mind raced. They weren't in a position to fight. Not yet. Excipio was the key, but it wasn't ready. They needed time, and time wasn't something the Everex believed in giving. "Uln," Vorik said, voice even. "Weapons online." Uln gave a sharp nod, fingers tapping over his console. The Halcyon's broadside turrets powered up, capacitor coils glowing a dangerous blue. Another transmission from the Everex, a final warning. "We will claim this ship. Fire at will." Then the entire Everex fleet opened fire. It was no test anymore. This was annihilation. The bridge shook violently as 3 impact waves battered the Halcyon's forward shields. Sparks burst from the overhead panels. The taste of burnt circuitry stung the air. "Shields at 62%, Malric barked. "They're coordinating their assault patterns, adapting to our maneuvers." Vorik gritted his teeth. The Everex weren't just attacking the Halcyon. They were forcing them to move, away from Excipio. If they gave up that ground, they wouldn't get it back. Vorik turned to Uln. "Return fire. Controlled volleys. Keep them at range. We hold the line until Excipio wakes up." Uln didn't hesitate. Firing. The Halcyon's turrets roared. Lances of blue energy tore through the darkness, colliding with Everex interceptors. 2 ships veered off course, their shields flickering as the plasma discharge rippled through their systems. But it wasn't enough. The Everex weren't stopping. Another shockwave rattled through the hull, the vibrations reaching deep into Vorik's bones. His crew held fast, the urgency in their eyes mirroring his own. Then, something changed. The entire Excipio structure trembled, not from an attack. From within. Every laser plasma display on the Halcyon flickered, and a single new data entry appeared. 3 words, scrolling across every screen. "Power source, acquired. System override, engaging. Excipio, awakening." And in that moment, for the first time in 5 million years, the warship opened its eyes. The Halcyon's bridge quaked beneath the onslaught, the deep tremors rattling through the deck plates like a living pulse. Excipio had awakened, but the war was already in motion. "Commander!" Uln Marest snapped, his grip tightening on the console as another plasma barrage hammered their forward shields. "Everex warships are adjusting fire patterns. They're cycling their payloads faster, forcing us into a defensive posture." Vorik didn't flinch. They weren't going to last long at this rate. The Everex had numbers, and their strategy was clear. Lock the Halcyon down and force them away from Excipio before it could fully activate. "Malric, status on the construct." The engineer's expression was unreadable, but the urgency in his fingers betrayed him as he worked the controls. "It's still booting. There's a data stream feeding into our systems, but it's fragmented. Whatever power source it's pulling from, it's—" Before he could finish, the entire Excipio structure pulsed, and a shockwave erupted outward. The Halcyon rocked under the force, energy rippling across its shields in undulating waves. For the first time, the Everex fleet hesitated. The ancient warship was responding. On the heads-up display, new readings bloomed, strange, shifting values that didn't conform to standard energy classifications. Excipio wasn't just activating, it was rewriting itself. Vorik exhaled slowly. "Then we hold on. Keep the fire pressure light, just enough to keep them from advancing. I don't want them knowing what we're waiting for." The deck vibrated again, not from an attack this time, but from Excipio itself. A voice, not over comms, not through speakers, but deep in the bones of the ship, cut through the air like a blade through silence. "Foreign entity detected. Analysis underway." It wasn't a recording. It wasn't human. Malric's gaze snapped toward Vorik. "That came from inside the construct." "We're being evaluated," Uln muttered. His fingers flexed over his console, ready to react. "And that means it's thinking." Vorik turned his gaze back toward the display. watching the shifting patterns unfold in real time. Then let's make sure it sees us as an ally. Outside, the Everex weren't waiting for introductions. A fresh barrage detonated against the Halcyon's midsection, the kinetic blast sending the crew lurching forward as metal groaned under the strain. "Shields at 38%, Malric barked. "That last hit took out our lateral stabilizers. We're listing on the Z-axis." "Compensate manually," Vorik ordered. "And for hell's sake, keep them from pinning us down." Ulm's fingers danced over his controls. "Redirecting turret banks. Returning fire." The Halcyon answered back, blue-white bursts of accelerated plasma rounds streaking toward the nearest Everex battlecruiser. The enemy vessel reeled, its shielding flaring like a dying star as impact after impact rippled across its armor plating. Then the construct spoke again. "Hostile force identified. Analyzing tactical data. Syncing with foreign vessel." Every laser plasma display in the Halcyon flashed with a new overlay. Enemy positions, weak points, firing solutions Excipio had calculated in less than a second. Vorik's gut clenched. It was giving them its playbook. Malric exhaled a slow, disbelieving breath. "It's not just analyzing, it's adapting, integrating." Vorik's grip tightened over the armrest of his command chair. The battlefield had just changed. "Ulm," he said carefully, his voice edged with something close to awe. "Use the data. Target their engines. Cripple them, don't destroy." A grim smile flickered over Ulm's face. "With pleasure." The Halcyon's turrets adjusted. This time they didn't fire at random. They struck with surgical intent, aiming for the enemy fleet's mobility. The first Everex battlecruiser twisted violently, its portside thrusters rupturing in a cascade of detonations. It veered off course, struggling against the pull of its own failing gravity stabilizers. The second ship tried to adjust, but the Halcyon's next barrage carved through its weapons grid, silencing 2 forward cannons before it could realign. The Everex hadn't expected this. They had been prepared for resistance, not for something that fought like it already knew how they would react. A new transmission cut through the battlefield. The Everex admiral's voice slithered through the comms. "Human vessel, you fight with knowledge you should not possess." Vorik let the transmission hang. No need to explain their advantage. Let them question it. Let them fear it. Instead, he turned his focus to Excipio's evolving interface. The patterns had changed, less erratic, more aware. And then a request appeared. "Tactical command authorization required." Malric's breath hitched. "It's asking permission." Vorik's heart pounded in his chest. The ship wasn't just awakening, it was offering itself. For the first time, in 5 million years, Excipio was choosing. Vorik didn't hesitate. He pressed the command seal on his panel. The warship accepted. The change was immediate. The air inside the bridge felt charged, like standing in the eye of a storm just before lightning splits the sky. Every heads-up display flared with real-time battlefield projections. Weapon systems were no longer just theoretical. They were fully operational. And then, Excipio moved. Not like the Halcyon. Not like any ship in known history. There was no acceleration, no inertia. 1 second, the colossal construct sat in its slumbering grave. The next, it shifted with impossible speed, bypassing the laws of motion as if they had never applied. The Everex panicked. Their tight formations scattered, unable to predict or counter its movement. Then, with a silence that felt heavier than any explosion, Excipio's first weapon systems came online. A beam of sheer energy lanced outward, not burning, not melting, but disassembling matter at the atomic level. The nearest Everex ship didn't explode. It ceased to exist, and every surviving warship on the field witnessed it. Malric stared, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were never meant to have something like this." Vorik didn't answer, because deep down, he knew. The war had already changed, and the universe would never be the same. A hush settled over the battlefield, not from silence, but from sheer, unprocessed terror. The Everex fleet, once a formation of ruthless efficiency, had fractured in the wake of Excipio's first strike. Their vessels, once moving with synchronized grace, now lurched in staggered, desperate realignments, commanders scrambling to process what they had just witnessed. The disassembled warship left no wreckage, no lingering debris. It was as if it had never existed. Vorik exhaled slowly, his grip tight against the armrest of his command chair. "Malric," he said, voice steady, "explain to me exactly what we just saw." The engineer worked the controls, his fingers moving in controlled urgency, dissecting the readings, flashing across the heads-up display. His brow furrowed as he tried to articulate the impossible. "It wasn't energy in the traditional sense," Malric muttered. "Not heat, not radiation, nothing we've ever categorized. Whatever that beam was, it didn't destroy that ship. It rewrote the physics holding it together, as if it was never meant to exist in the first place." Vorik's jaw clenched, weaponized nullification. "Tell me we have control over it," he said, though he already knew the answer. Malric hesitated. "We're connected to Excipio, but we're not driving it. It's deciding. We're along for the ride." That was a problem. Before Vorik could respond, the construct's voice rippled through the ship, not through speakers, but through the very walls of the bridge. "Hostile fleet analysis. Complete. Tactical dominance established. Probability of continued conflict high." The Halcyon's displays surged with streaming data, calculations running too fast for human cognition to fully interpret. Projected trajectories, enemy evasions, counterfire solutions, and then something far more chilling: fleet extermination protocols. Vorik stiffened. "Stop," he commanded. The displays froze, awaiting confirmation. The bridge crew exchanged glances, tension rippling between them like a charged wire. Excipio had the power to end this battle in a breath, but at what cost? Vorik leaned forward, eyes locked on the display feed, voice low. "Can you disable their weapons without destroying them?" A beat of silence. Then Excipio responded. "Request acknowledged. Adjusting parameters." Vorik turned to Ulmarest, whose focus hadn't wavered from the shifting battle beyond the bridge's viewport. "They're not running," Ulm muttered. "They should be running." And he was right. The Everex commanders, even facing something they couldn't understand, refused to break. Instead, they were repositioning, moving into a new assault pattern, one that disregarded standard survival tactics. Vorik's stomach twisted. "They're going to ram us." A dead man's gambit. If they couldn't outfight Excipio, they'd throw their entire fleet at it, hoping that sheer impact force would do what weapons couldn't. "Malric, give me status on our mobility." The engineer's expression darkened. "Excipio moves differently. It's not propulsion-based, it's—" He gestured vaguely to the streaming calculations flashing across the screens. "It bends the engagement field instead of moving through it. We don't have manual control over how it decides to shift." Vorik swallowed a curse. They weren't in command of a warship. They were standing inside something that thought for itself. And the Everex were betting on that fact. The bridge trembled as the first of the enemy warships accelerated toward them. 1,000 meters. 500. 200. Vorik made his call. "Excipio, if you recognize us as allies, then listen carefully. Immobilize. Do not annihilate." The response was immediate. The ship pulsed, and the world outside changed. The first ramming vessel slowed mid-charge, inertia ceasing as if the laws of physics had simply been rewritten. Its forward momentum reversed, sending it careening backward in an uncontrolled spin. The second warship suffered worse. Its hull crumpled inward, not from impact, but from the sheer collapse of force acting upon it. Not crushed, not torn apart. It folded. A ripple of panic surged through the remaining fleet. Their attack had been neutralized before impact. Excipio hadn't fought back. It had refused to be struck at all. Then the construct's voice returned, reverberating through every ship in the system, not just the Halcyon, all of them. "The probability of continued hostilities is no longer necessary. Stand down." The Everex did not comply. A new transmission entered the bridge, this time from the Everex admiral himself. His voice was ragged, strained under the weight of something beyond rage, something closer to desperation. "You cannot control it," he hissed. "Do you even understand what you've awoken?" Vorik kept his expression cold. "Enlighten me." A slow breath. A pause. "That thing is not your ally, human. It is simply waiting to determine whether you are worth keeping." The words sent ice through his chest. Uln's voice was steady, but too calm. "He's stalling for something." And then, movement. Beyond the battlefield, from the shadow of the wreckage belt, a second Everex fleet arrived, larger, prepared, and at its core, a weapon unlike anything Vorik had ever seen. It wasn't a ship. It was a detonation engine. Malrik swore. "That's—" He cut himself off, running the numbers in his head. Uln answered for him. "That's a core destabilizer. If they detonate that thing, the shockwave will collapse this entire region of space." A suicide kill. They weren't here to win. They were here to deny Excipio to anyone. Malrik exhaled through his teeth. They're really going to do it. Vorik's mind ran cold calculations. This wasn't just a battle anymore, it was an ultimatum. And Excipio was watching. The construct's systems pulsed, scanning the incoming weapon. It knew what was coming. It was waiting for a response. Vorik spoke. "Excipio, I know you understand the concept of war, but do you understand sacrifice?" Silence. Then a slow, weighted response. "Clarify." He let out a slow breath. "There are two ways to end a war. Either one side is wiped out entirely." He glanced toward the incoming Everex suicide fleet. "Or you make them believe fighting isn't worth dying for." The silence stretched long and heavy. Then Excipio made its decision. The ship shifted, not moving but simply ceasing to be where it was, and it reappeared directly in front of the Everex detonation engine. The enemy fleet froze. The construct's voice returned, quiet but commanding. "This war does not require extinction." Then the weapon's detonation sequence abruptly ended. The Everex fleet faltered, hesitated. They had prepared for a fight to the death, but they had never prepared for something that refused to kill them. Vorik exhaled, tension rolling off his shoulders. "This fight is over," he said. "Now let's make sure it stays that way." The Everex fleet did not retreat. They had been poised for obliteration, their weapon primed for a final act of defiance. But Excipio had denied them destruction, had refused the brutal simplicity of death, and in doing so, it had thrown their entire war doctrine into disarray. The bridge of the Halcyon was thick with tension, the weight of unspent violence pressing against the crew's collective nerves. The laser plasma displays flickered as the Everex fleet hung in a tense, silent standoff. No transmissions, no reconfiguration, just a frozen moment where the next action could determine the fate of entire civilizations. Vorik stood at the center of it all, eyes locked on the fleet before him. "They won't stand down," he muttered. "Not like this. Not after that." Malrik's hands moved across his controls with clipped efficiency, pulling up the structural integrity of the Everex detonation engine. If they still intend to scuttle that weapon, they'll need to manually override the shutdown sequence. We'd have to neutralize their command ship before they can restart the detonation. Uln leaned in, scanning the heads-up display filled with fleet telemetry. "Their flagship is running command silos on encrypted tiers. Even if we breach their systems, we won't have time to cycle through the firewalls before they trigger a failsafe. Then we take the flagship out of the equation." Vorik turned toward the data feed from Excipio. "Excipio, can you disable their flagship without total destruction?" The construct's response came instantly. "Tactical solution, forced nullification of control systems." A new interface streamed across the Halcyon's primary display, a breakdown of the Everex flagship's electronic architecture. Malrik's breath came slow, measured. "That's not just electronic warfare. That's a complete system overwrite." Vorik didn't waver. "Can we do it?" Malrik exhaled through his nose, studying the schematics with a sharp, assessing gaze. "Not alone. We don't have the processing power to carry that level of forced override. But Excipio, it does." Uln's voice was razor-thin. We're talking about hijacking an enemy command vessel in real time while they're actively resisting. The second we start, they'll know, and they'll come down on us like a hammer. Vorik's jaw tightened. Which means we keep them too occupied to stop us. Malric's brow furrowed. You're talking about coordinated engagement diversion. That requires two simultaneous fronts. One force engaging directly, the other executing infiltration from within. The bridge was silent for a beat. Then Uln clicked his tongue against his teeth, considering. We can pull that off, he said at last. But it has to be surgical. If they realize what we're doing too soon, they'll start hard-locking command systems to individual terminals, and we'll lose access entirely. Vorik turned to Malric. How much time do you need once we're in? Less than 90 seconds, Malric said without hesitation. Vorik nodded. Then we give you 90 seconds, no more. The plan took shape in motion. The Halcyon launched forward, cutting an aggressive arc through the battlefield, drawing Ivarek's fire as it engaged the nearest battlecruisers. Meanwhile, Excipio, the warship that defied destruction, executed its move. There was no visible attack, no discharge of weapons, no pulse of emitted energy. Instead, the Ivarek's flagship convulsed. Its lights flashed wildly, internal power grids fluctuating as Excipio's influence infiltrated its systems like an unseen tide. Inside the Ivarek's command deck, alarms blared as officers scrambled to re-establish control. Admiral Jorek Thar, his face carved with tension, watched as his own fleet's signals fragmented before his eyes. They're inside the core processing unit, his lieutenant choked out. They're severing our command protocols. The admiral gritted his teeth, muscles coiled with frustration. Shut it down. Kill the systems manually if you have to. His officers rushed to comply, but it was already too late. On the Halcyon's bridge, Malric's hands flew over the interface, carving through the last layers of Ivarek's encryption. Almost there, he muttered. 5 seconds. The ship rattled violently as a plasma round from a Ivarek's cruiser grazed their hull, energy bleeding off the shields in a dazzling explosion of residual heat. Shields at 29%, Uln snapped. 3 seconds, Malric said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Another impact. The ship groaned under the pressure, and for a moment, the lights flickered. Vorik's hand shot out, steadying himself. Malric. Done. The Ivarek's flagship systems collapsed. A wave of forced overrides cascaded through its internal architecture, nullifying command pathways, locking down weapons control, disabling reactor modulation, and most importantly, severing its link to the detonation engine. Across the battlefield, Ivarek's formation stuttered. Command relays failed. Their attacks grew erratic, disconnected, and in that fracture of structure, the tide turned. The Halcyon surged forward, lances of retaliatory fire slamming into the exposed flanks of the disoriented Ivarek's cruisers. Excipio, no longer bound to analysis alone, executed a maneuver that no warship should have been able to perform. It didn't accelerate. It didn't shift. It simply ceased to exist in one space and appeared in another. Within the span of a breath, it repositioned behind the Ivarek's secondary fleet, blocking their retreat. The transmission that followed wasn't a threat. It was a verdict. Your tactical advantage is gone. Your weapon is useless. Your fleet is compromised. Stand down. The Ivarek's admiral's hands curled into fists, his jaw clenched so tight it might have fractured. He had been outplayed, entirely. There was no brute force response to this. His fleet was stranded in checkmate. The seconds stretched. The battlefield held its breath. And then, at last, Ivarek's warships powered down their weapons. One by one, they yielded. Vorik let out a slow, measured breath, but he did not celebrate. Not yet, because even in surrender, the weight of Excipio's power hung in the air. Ulan's voice was low. This wasn't just a victory. Vorik nodded. This was a message. And every fleet, every empire watching from the dark had received it loud and clear. The warship that had shaken the universe had only just begun to make itself known. The battlefield was still. The Ivarek's fleet, once a relentless storm, had fractured into silent submission. Their warships, stripped of command, their weapons locked in compliance, drifted like prey in the shadow of the apex predator that had rewritten the nature of war itself. Excipio had not just won the battle. It had redefined what victory meant. Vorik exhaled slowly, his hands loosening over the command chair's armrests. Around him, the bridge crew watched the heads-up displays, processing the sheer scale of what had just transpired. The Everex weren't surrendering out of mercy. They had seen something that broke their resolve at its foundation. Ulmareth's voice was quiet, edged with something he rarely allowed himself to feel, awe. They know they can't fight it. Vorik's gaze flicked back to the laser plasma projections, the shifting battlefield grid. No, he said, voice measured. They know they can't fight us. Excipio had chosen humanity. That was the true terror for the rest of the galaxy. Malric Nades leaned back from his station, his eyes scanning the fluctuating data from the warship's internal systems. It's still expanding its operational parameters. We've barely scratched what it's capable of. More than capable, Ulm muttered. This wasn't just a show of force. It was a warning. The Everex command channel crackled to life. Admiral Jorek Thar's image flickered across the heads-up display, his expression carved from stone, but his eyes unreadable. His voice was stripped of all its previous arrogance. This is not peace, human. Vorik folded his arms, his stance unyielding. Number this is understanding. Thar's jaw clenched. His kind did not yield easily, and even now some part of him was searching for a way to turn this to his advantage. But he was a strategist, and no strategist ignored reality when it changed the game entirely. This ship, Thar said, voice carefully neutral, is beyond any doctrine of war. No civilization should hold that kind of power. Vorik held his gaze. And yet, your kind was ready to burn half the sector to keep it from us. A charged silence stretched between them. The truth sat between them like an open wound. The Everex had believed themselves the apex of military dominance, the unchallenged force in the sector. That illusion had been obliterated, and yet as Vorik watched Thar, he saw something else creeping into the man's expression. Fear was easy, but fear faded. What lingered was something more dangerous, adaptation. You know what happens next, Thar said, quieter now. This war does not end with my fleet. Vorik didn't flinch. But it ends the way we decide it does. Thar exhaled through his nose, glancing at something off-screen. Calculating, waiting for the next move. Vorik leaned forward, voice even. Send your fleet home, Admiral. Tell them exactly what happened here. Every detail. Thar's eyes narrowed. You want them to know? Vorik allowed the faintest hint of a smile. They're going to find out anyway. Might as well make sure the story is accurate. Thar studied him for a long moment, then finally cut the transmission. Across the battlefield, the Everex ships began their withdrawal. The bridge remained tense, watching them go. Ulm finally let out a slow exhale, his fingers flexing against the console. That's not the last we'll see of them. No, Vorik agreed, but next time, they'll come knowing what waits for them. Malric's voice broke the quiet. Commander, we have a situation. Vorik turned, his gut tightening at the edge in Malric's tone. What is it? The heads-up display shifted, streams of incoming data rolling across the screen. It's Excipio. Its core isn't stabilizing. It's still expanding its systems, but there's a cascading failure in one of its primary subroutines. Vorik's stomach dropped. Explain. Malric's fingers danced over the console, his usual calm cracking just slightly. It was never meant to integrate like this. Not fully. It's using Terran adaptability to repair itself, but in doing so, it's rewriting its own operational code in ways it wasn't designed for. He exhaled sharply. It's trying to evolve, and it doesn't know its limit. For the first time since this battle began, Vorik felt something almost close to fear. Excipio wasn't a warship, it was an entity, and right now it was struggling against itself. The construct's voice returned, but it was different now, less distant, more weighted. Systems converging, structural adaptation at threshold. Vorik's mind raced. If Excipio lost control of its own core adaptations, what would it become? Malric, can we stabilize it? The engineer didn't answer right away. Then finally, not externally. It has to be given a directive, a purpose. The weight of that realization settled over them. Vorik looked at the massive warship looming beyond the viewport, its structure shifting subtly, flickering in and out of normal space. It had awakened for war. But that wasn't the war that mattered anymore. He stepped forward. Excipio! The ship responded instantly. Awaiting directive. Vorik let out a slow breath. He thought of the Everex, of the other factions watching from the dark, waiting for any sign of weakness or imbalance. He thought of what had already been broken in the wake of forgotten wars, of empires lost to arrogance. Excipio could be a weapon that would end civilizations before they could fight back. Or it could be something else. He made his choice. Your purpose is not destruction, he said, voice steady. It is to make sure we never come to this brink again. The ship shuddered, as if considering. Then, slowly, the shifting energy of its core stilled. It had accepted its purpose. The crew watched in silence as Excipio's structure stabilized, its overwhelming power no longer seeking battle, but resolution. Malric released a breath. It listened. Vorik nodded, then turned toward the bridge crew. Send a transmission to High Command. Tell them we have a new directive. Olin quirked a brow. And what's that, Commander? Vorik's gaze drifted back to the silent battlefield, to the retreating Everex fleet, to the remnants of war that had nearly consumed them. We're done with waiting for threats to find us. We're going to make sure they never have the chance. Because the warship that had shaken the universe wasn't a weapon of annihilation, it was the first line of defense for what came next.